Hey guys, tonight we're going to pull back the dusty velvet curtain on a truly fascinating corner of American history. The peculiar, often baffling world of colonial laws and punishments. Imagine yourself stepping off a creaky wooden ship onto the cobbled streets of a 17th century New England town. The air is crisp, perhaps a bit smoky from hearth fires, and a quiet hum of life pulses through the settlement. But underneath that calm facade, a strict, unyielding moral compass governs every single action, every whisper, every thought. You find yourself in a place where your morning stroll might be considered a grave offense, and forgetting to attend church could lead to a very public display of shame. Yes, it's a world where a misplaced giggle or a slightly too bright dress could land you in serious hot water. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week. The sheer number of seemingly innocent activities that were deemed illegal might just make your modern head spin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a treat to know just how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a settlement where God's word, as interpreted by the puritanical elite, was the absolute law. This wasn't just about personal piety. It was about creating a perfect society, a city upon a hill, where every individual's behavior reflected on the community's standing with the Almighty. The very foundations of these colonies, particularly in New England, were steeped in a fervent religious zeal that permeated every aspect of daily life, right down to the minutiae of personal conduct. You'd wake up, not to the gentle rhythm of your own desires, but to the invisible, yet ever-present, hand of communal expectation guiding your every step. Think of it. From the moment you opened your eyes, you were essentially on a spiritual performance review, with your neighbors as the very watchful auditors. This intense desire for moral purity wasn't unique to the American colonies, of course. Many European societies of the time had their own strictures. But here, in this new, often harsh environment, the stakes felt even higher. The colonists believed they were forging a new Eden, and any deviation, however minor, could invite divine wrath. So, you'd see ministers wielding immense influence, often more than civil authorities, shaping not just sermons but also legal codes. This blend of church and state, so alien to our modern sensibilities, was the bedrock of their legal system. You might wonder if this system actually worked in making people better. Historians still argue whether the extreme focus on moral purity truly reduced crime or simply drove it underground, creating a society of outward conformity masking private transgressions. One fascinating tidbit you might encounter is the concept of watching. In some towns, certain individuals, often respected elders, were appointed as official watchers or tithing men. Their job wasn't just to look out for fires or trespassers. It was to observe and report any moral failings they witnessed. Imagine a neighborhood watch, but instead of reporting suspicious packages, they're noting if you laughed too loudly on the Sabbath or if your children were playing instead of praying. It's like living under a constant, benign, yet incredibly persistent gaze. You'd probably think twice before even humming a secular tune on a Sunday afternoon. This pervasive scrutiny meant that even the most minor infractions rarely went unnoticed, creating a powerful disincentive for anything considered out of line. It wasn't about catching big criminals. It was about ensuring everyone stayed on the straight and narrow path, even if that path was incredibly narrow. As you continue your quiet journey through this colonial town, you'd soon encounter the bedrock of its legal system, the so-called blue laws. Now, the term blue law itself has a bit of a misty origin. Some historians suggest it came from the blue paper on which these strict regulations were printed. Others propose it simply referred to something rigidly moralistic, perhaps even a bit grim like a true blue Puritan. Whatever their etymology, these laws were anything but lighthearted. They weren't just about prohibiting murder or theft. They delved deep into the fabric of daily life, dictating everything from what you could wear to how loudly you could speak. You see, the aim was to eliminate vice, idleness, and anything that might distract from religious observance or productive labor. Imagine a legislative body that also doubled as a moral compass, pointing fingers at anything deemed ungodly or simply unproductive. For instance, one of the most pervasive aspects of the Blue Laws was their intense focus on public morality. You couldn't just walk down the street whistling a happy tune if that tune wasn't hymn. Public displays of affection? Forget about it. Even seemingly innocent pastimes like card playing or dice games were often strictly forbidden, seen as gateways to gambling, laziness, and ultimately sin. You might find yourself scratching your head, wondering how a society could function under such pervasive scrutiny. But remember, the community was small, interconnected, and highly interdependent. Every individual's perceived righteousness contributed to the collective good, or so they believed. A single sinner, in their view, could invite the wrath of God upon the entire settlement. It put a lot of pressure on you to conform, didn't it? One quirky tidbit about these Blue Laws is that they often varied wildly from colony to colony, and even from town to town within the same colony. What was a grave offense in Puritan Massachusetts might have been merely frowned upon, or even ignored, in the more religiously tolerant Rhode Island or the Quaker haven of Pennsylvania. This created a patchwork of legal oddities across the colonial landscape. So, while you might be safely playing a game of checkers in Philadelphia, doing the same thing just a few hundred miles north could land you in the stocks. It's almost like a historical game of legal roulette, where the rules shifted depending on which dirt path you were walking on. The enforcement of these laws was often handled by local officials, sometimes called tithing men or constables, who were often respected members of the community. They weren't always paid much, if anything, for their duties, suggesting a strong civic or religious motivation. They had the power to enter homes to ensure rules were being followed, particularly regarding Sabbath observance. You can picture it now, a stern-faced figure knocking on your door, not for a sales pitch, but to check if you're actually reading scripture or just secretly mending a shirt. Historians still argue whether this system of local enforcement was truly effective in preventing crime, or if it merely fostered an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment among the populace. Some suggest that widespread public support, rather than fear of punishment, was the primary driver of conformity. The very concept of what constituted a crime under these Blue Laws was expansive. It wasn't just about harming others. It was about harming your own soul, or the soul of the community, through your actions. You were expected to be productive, pious, and proper. Any deviation from this narrow path was not just a personal failing, but a societal threat. This often meant that punishments weren't just about deterrence. They were about public shaming and correction, designed to bring the errant individual back into the fold of the community. It's a very different approach to justice than our modern rehabilitative or punitive systems. You weren't just paying a fine. You were often paying for your perceived moral failing with your reputation. Now, let's drift deeper into the most restrictive of these colonial regulations, the Sabbath day strictures. If you thought the general Blue Laws were intense, wait until you experience a colonial Sunday. For many Puritan and other Protestant communities, the Sabbath wasn't just a day off. It was a sacred obligation, a day dedicated entirely to God and religious observance. You were expected to cease all worldly labor, recreation, and even idle chatter from sundown on Saturday until sundown on Sunday. Imagine the quiet, the almost eerie stillness that would descend upon the towns. The only sounds you might hear would be the rustle of leaves, the distant bleating of sheep, and perhaps the solemn tolling of the church bell. Breaking the Sabbath was a serious offense, often met with public shaming or fines. Consider this scenario. You've spent your week toiling in the fields, your muscles aching, and all you crave is a moment of quiet leisure. But come Sunday, even something as innocuous as whittling a piece of wood, tending to your garden beyond essential needs, or even kissing your spouse could land you in trouble. Yes, even displays of affection were deemed inappropriate. Imagine trying to explain to a modern couple that a Sunday kiss could be considered a breach of the peace. It's almost comically restrictive, isn't it? One mainstream historical fact is that in many colonies, laws explicitly forbade traveling on the Sabbath unless it was absolutely necessary, such as for attending church or for medical emergencies. You couldn't just take a leisurely Sunday drive, or, in this case, a leisurely Sunday stroll with your horse. A quirky tidbit is that some towns even had specific laws about children playing on Sabbath. They were encouraged to read scripture or engage in other pious activities, but definitely no games, no running, no boisterous laughter. You can almost picture exasperated colonial parents trying to keep their energetic offspring subdued for an entire day, whispering, "Quiet now, dear, lest the constable hear." It's a challenge many modern parents can probably relate to, albeit with vastly different stakes. This strict adherence to Sabbath laws wasn't just about personal piety. It was a public declaration of the community's devotion. Any visible deviation could be seen as a challenge to the collective spiritual well-being. The enforcement of these laws was remarkably thorough. Town constables and tithing men often patrolled the streets and even peered into windows to ensure compliance. If you're caught, say, drawing water from a well for anything other than immediate consumption, or carrying a burden that wasn't absolutely necessary, you could face consequences. Historians still argue whether the extreme focus on Sabbath observance led to genuine spiritual growth or simply fostered a culture of outward performance and hidden resentment. Was it truly about devotion or just about avoiding punishment? The punishment for Sabbath breaking were often public. You might be fined, or worse, put in the stocks for a few hours, exposed to the stares and occasional jeers of your neighbors. This wasn't just about financial penalty. It was about public humiliation, a powerful deterrent in tightly knit communities where reputation was paramount. Remember that pervasive scrutiny we talked about earlier? On the Sabbath, it reached its zenith. You were essentially under divine and communal surveillance, every single move subject to interpretation and judgment. You could practically feel the silent eyes on you, ensuring you stayed within the narrow confines of acceptable behavior. It was a day designed for spiritual reflection, yes, but for many, it must have felt more like a test of endurance. Having navigated the quiet strictures of the Sabbath, let's now turn our attention to the more direct and often stark reality of public humiliation tactics in colonial America. When you broke a law, especially one that challenged public morality or community order, the punishment wasn't always a simple fine or imprisonment as we understand it today. Often, the goal was less about isolating you from society and more about integrating you back into it, but only after a very public display of your transgression. Think of it as a form of social conditioning, designed to make you deeply regret your actions and serve as a living, breathing warning to everyone else. You see, in these close-knit communities, your reputation was everything. Losing face publicly could be far more agonizing than a physical lashing, though those certainly happen too. One mainstream historical fact is that various devices and methods were employed, each designed to expose the offender to the community's gaze and judgment. These weren't hidden away in some dungeon. They were front and center, usually in the town square or near the meeting house. This ensured maximum visibility. Imagine standing there, exposed to the elements, as your neighbors, friends, and even family walked by, their expressions a mix of pity, scorn, and perhaps a touch of grim satisfaction that justice was being served. It's a level of public accountability that would make even the most hardened reality TV star blush. A quirky tidbit is how often the punishment would fit the perceived crime in a symbolic way. If you were accused of gossiping or slander, you might be forced to wear a sign proclaiming your offense, or even have your tongue held in a cleft stick for a period. It was a very literal interpretation of the punishment fits the crime, almost theatrical in its design. You can practically hear the whispered comments and judgmental clucks from the onlookers. It was a constant reminder that your words, however fleeting, could have very real and tangible consequences. It makes you think twice about complaining about your neighbor's rooster, doesn't it? The effectiveness of these public shaming methods is a topic historians still argue over. Did they truly deter future offenses, or did they sometimes backfire, hardening the offender or creating outcasts? Some scholars suggest that in small, interdependent communities, the desire to regain one's standing and avoid future humiliation was a powerful motivator for conformity. Others argue that repeated public shaming could lead to a permanent loss of status, pushing individuals to the fringes of society rather than reforming them. Consider the atmosphere surrounding these public punishments. It wasn't just about the person being shamed. It was a community event, albeit a somber one. Children would be brought to witness these displays, often to instill a fear of wrongdoing and teach them the strict moral codes from a young age. You'd see hushed conversations, stern faces, and perhaps a few nervous glances among the crowd, everyone reminded of the thin line between conformity and public disgrace. The air would be thick with unspoken judgment, a palpable weight pressing down on the individual standing in the stocks or wearing a visible mark of shame. It was a constant, stark visual lesson in what not to do, etched into the collective memory of the town. Let's zoom in on perhaps the most iconic images of colonial punishment, the stocks and pillory. You've seen them in old drawings, perhaps even in modern movie sets. But to imagine them in their colonial context is to grasp their true purpose. These weren't just props. They were grim, wooden stages for public humiliation, prominently displayed in the town square, ensuring maximum visibility for the transgressor. You'd find them near the meeting house or market, ensuring that nearly everyone passing by would witness the spectacle. The stocks were typically a wooden frame with holes for a person's ankles and sometimes wrists, forcing them to sit or lie in a crouch position. The pillory, on the other hand, was taller, designed to secure a person's head and hands in holes in a wooden board, forcing them to stand. Both left the offender exposed and vulnerable. Imagine the discomfort. Your limbs stiffening, your neck aching, and the relentless sun or chilling wind beating down on you. But the physical discomfort was often secondary to the psychological torment. One mainstream historical fact is that the duration of time spent in the stocks or pillory varied greatly depending on the offense, ranging from a few hours to an entire day, or even multiple days. For relatively minor infractions, like public drunkenness or breaking Sabbath laws, you might be in for a few hours. For more serious offenses, like perjury or fraud, you could be there much longer, perhaps even with additional indignities. A quirky tidbit related to these devices is that often, onlookers were encouraged or even expected to throw rotten vegetables, mud, or even animal dung at the person in the stocks or pillory. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of public disgust. In some places, it was almost a sanctioned part of the punishment, adding another layer of degradation. You can almost hear the thud of a bruised apple hitting the wooden frame, followed by a chorus of jeers. It's a stark reminder that colonial justice was often a communal affair, where the public was an active participant in the shaming process. You'd have to develop a thick skin, both literally and figuratively, to endure such an ordeal. Historians still argue whether the physical discomfort or the public humiliation was the more effective deterrent. Some scholars suggest that the intense social pressure and loss of reputation inflicted by public shaming were far more powerful than any physical pain. Others point to anecdotal evidence of individuals enduring the stocks with defiance, suggesting that for some, it merely solidified their status as an outcast rather than leading to reform. The specific crimes that might land you in the stocks or pillory were diverse. You could find yourself there for lying, gossiping, minor theft, public drunkenness, or even for contempt of court. The sheer variety of offenses speaks to the broad scope of colonial moral policing. Remember that earlier mention of minor infractions? This is where many of them played out. You'd probably start to walk with a peculiar, self-conscious gait, constantly checking your actions and words, lest you end up with your head stuck in a hole, contemplating the wisdom of your last indiscretion. From the physical discomfort of the stocks, let's now transition to a more subtle, yet equally powerful, form of public shaming, the concept of the scarlet letters. While Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel might be the first thing that comes to mind, the practice of public branding or requiring specific identifying marks for offenders was a very real and often grim aspect of colonial justice. This wasn't always about a literal A for adultery. It could be any letter, any symbol designed to permanently mark you as a societal outcast or a transgressor. You wouldn't just endure a temporary public spectacle. You would carry your punishment with you every single day for everyone to see. One mainstream historical fact is that various colonies employed forms of public branding. For instance, in some areas, thieves might be branded with a T on their hand or forehead, or a B for blasphemy. This was meant to be a permanent record of their crime, making it difficult for them to move to a new town and start fresh, or even to hide their past from potential employers or neighbors. Imagine trying to live a normal life with a letter seared onto your skin, a constant reminder of your past misdeeds, visible to anyone who glanced your way. It was a punishment designed to extend far beyond the initial act, creating a lasting social stigma. A quirky tidbit is that however, the idea of forcing someone to wear a visible mark of shame, even if not literally seared into the skin, was indeed a colonial practice. In some cases, individuals found guilty of certain offenses might be compelled to wear a specific colored cap or a badge denoting their crime for a set period. It's like having a permanent, albeit removable, neon sign flashing, "I messed up," above your head, even if you just wanted to grab a quiet pint at the local tavern. You'd probably find yourself walking with your head down, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of these public markings. Did they genuinely lead to rehabilitation and reintegration, or did they simply create a class of permanent outsiders, unable to fully participate in community life? Some scholars suggest that for many, the shame and difficulty in finding work or acceptance due to such a mark could lead to further desperation and crime. Others argue that the constant public reminder served as a powerful deterrent, forcing individuals to live exemplary lives thereafter just to escape the stigma. The societal impact of such a mark was profound. You weren't just a person. It was a form of social death, a deliberate stripping away of your good name and standing within the community. Remember how reputation was paramount in these small, interdependent societies? The Scarlet Letter, whether real or symbolic, was the ultimate assault on that reputation, a public declaration that you had fallen from grace, potentially forever. It was a constant visual sermon to everyone else: conform or risk becoming an outcast. From the visible marks of shame, let's now turn our attention to the more aesthetically minded, yet equally restrictive colonial laws, the quirky sumptuary laws. These weren't about crime in the sense of theft or violence, but about maintaining social order and hierarchy through regulating personal appearance, particularly clothing. You might think, what does my hat have to do with the law? Well, in colonial America, your hat, your coat, and even the trim on your dress could all be subject to legal scrutiny. One mainstream historical fact is that sumptuary laws were quite common across various colonies, especially in New England, and were designed to prevent people from dressing above their station or displaying excessive luxury. The idea was to prevent social climbing and to keep clear distinctions between different classes of people, from the laborer to the merchant to the gentry. If you were a common farmer, for instance, you simply weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics, colors, or adornments that were reserved for the wealthier elite. Imagine trying to pick out an outfit for the day, not based on what you liked, but on a strict legal code dictating what your social status allowed you to wear. It's like a fashion police, but with actual legal consequences. A quirky tidbit is that some of these laws got incredibly specific, almost comically so. For example, laws might dictate that only people with a certain amount of taxable estate could wear lace, silk, or silver buttons. You might find regulations against excessive ribbons, elaborate ruffles, or even specific types of embroidery. It's as if the lawmakers were meticulously inspecting every thread and buckle. You can almost picture an official standing at the town entrance, scrutinizing your attire, ready to fine you for a rogue splash of crimson on your otherwise drab tunic. One might even wonder if tailors and seamstresses had to become amateur legal experts, advising their clients on what was permissible within the latest statutes. Historians still argue whether these sumptuary laws were truly effective in maintaining social order, or if they simply bred resentment and fostered an underground market for forbidden finery. Some scholars suggest that while they might have prevented outright extravagance, human nature's desire for display often found loopholes or led to subtle forms of defiance. Others contend that in tightly controlled communities, the fear of public shaming and fines largely kept people in line with their designated sartorial roles. The reasoning behind these laws was multifaceted. Beyond social hierarchy, there was often a strong moral and religious component. Extravagant dress was seen as a sign of vanity, pride, and worldliness, vices that Puritan communities, in particular, sought to suppress. It was believed that plain living and plain dressing encouraged humility and focused attention on spiritual matters rather than earthly desires. So, if you ever felt the urge to don a flamboyant feathered cap, you might think twice, not just because of the cost, but because of the stern gaze of your neighbors and the potential for a visit from the local constable. It was a constant reminder that your personal choices, even in clothing, were always under the watchful eye of the community. Moving from your wardrobe to your dinner plate, you might be surprised to learn that colonial law often extended its reach to your culinary habits. Yes, prepare yourself for some strange food and drink rules. These weren't just about hygiene or safety. They were deeply rooted in social control, economic regulation, and, of course, the ever-present moral compass of the era. You couldn't just freely choose what to consume, or even how much, without potentially running afoul of a local ordinance. One mainstream historical fact is that laws were often enacted to regulate the sale and consumption of alcohol. Drunkenness was seen as a serious moral failing and a threat to public order, so measures were put in place to control its proliferation. This could mean restrictions on when and where alcohol could be sold, who could purchase it, often excluding servants or indentured laborers without permission, and even limits on how much a person could drink in a public establishment. Imagine a bartender cutting you off not because you've had too much, but because the law literally says you can't have any more. It's a very different kind of happy hour, isn't it? A quirky tidbit is that some laws even dictated the type of alcohol allowed or the price at which it could be sold, sometimes favoring local brews over imported spirits to boost the colonial economy. In Massachusetts, for example, there are laws that made it illegal to drink healths, that is, to make toasts. The reasoning was that such practices were paganistic and led to excessive drinking. You'd have to be careful not to accidentally raise your tankard in celebration, lest you be seen as engaging in a profane act. It's almost as if they wanted to remove all joy from the act of consumption, leaving only the grim necessity. Historians still argue about the true impact of these food and drink laws. Did they genuinely reduce public drunkenness and foster healthier communities? Or did they simply push illicit consumption into private homes and unlicensed taverns? Some scholars suggest that the laws were often difficult to enforce, especially in sprawling or less populated areas, leading to widespread but unpunished violations. Others contend that the threat of public shaming and fines was enough to ensure a relatively sober and orderly populace, at least outwardly. Beyond alcohol, there were occasionally regulations on other foodstuffs, often for economic reasons or to prevent perceived waste. While not as common as sumptuary laws for clothing, some towns might have had rules about excessive feasting or the sale of certain goods during times of scarcity. You were expected to be frugal and sensible in your consumption, reflecting the Protestant work ethic that permeated much of colonial life. So, while you might be craving a lavish feast, you'd probably stick to a simple, practical meal, lest you be accused of gluttony or wasteful indulgence. It was all about demonstrating self-control and communal responsibility, even down to the last bite of your humble pudding. Having considered what you could and couldn't eat and drink, let's now consider the colonial obsession with productivity, embodied in their strict laws targeting idle hands and vagrancy. In a society where survival often depended on every individual contributing to the collective good, idleness wasn't just a personal failing. It was seen as a threat to the entire community. You were expected to be engaged in productive labor, whether it was farming, weaving, carpentry, or tending to your household. If you weren't actively contributing, you might quickly find yourself on the wrong side of the law. One mainstream historical fact is that many colonies had laws explicitly prohibiting vagrancy, loitering, and begging. These statutes were designed to ensure that everyone was engaged in some form of work and to prevent a class of unemployed or unproductive citizens from becoming a burden on the community. If you're found to be without a steady occupation or a clear means of support, you could be arrested, fined, or even publicly whipped. Imagine just trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon nap in the town square. You might be woken up by a stern constable inquiring about your life choices. It's a very different kind of societal expectation than our modern notion of leisure time. A quirky tidbit is that these laws sometimes extended to seemingly innocent activities. For instance, in some areas, merely wandering abroad without a clear purpose could be considered an offense. Or, if you were a servant or apprentice, leaving your master's service without permission, even for a short time, could be deemed a form of vagrancy and lead to harsh penalties. You can almost picture someone sneaking out for a quiet stroll and suddenly having to invent a plausible reason for their walk on the spot. It sounds almost comical, but the underlying severity was very real. It reflects a society where individual freedom was often secondary to communal order and economic necessity. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of these anti-idleness laws. Did they genuinely foster a more industrious society? Or did they simply punish those who, for various reasons, couldn't find work or were struggling? Some scholars suggest that the laws often disproportionately affected the poor, the elderly, or those with disabilities, pushing them further into marginalized positions. Others contend that in a developing economy, these laws were essential for ensuring a stable workforce and preventing social decay. The punishments for being idle or vagrant could be quite severe. Besides fines or public whipping, you might be sentenced to forced labor, either for the town or for a private individual who would take you in. You could even be warned out of a town, meaning you were legally compelled to leave the settlement and seek your fortune elsewhere. Remember the interdependency of these communities? Being cast out meant losing access to support networks, trade, and even basic necessities. It was a clear message. If you weren't pulling your weight, you weren't welcome. So, next time you consider a lazy afternoon, perhaps be thankful you're not living under the watchful eye of a colonial anti-idleness officer. Now, let's turn to perhaps the most chilling and certainly the most infamous chapter in colonial law, the witchcraft hysteria laws. While the Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 are the most widely known, accusations and trials for witchcraft occurred in various forms throughout the colonies, albeit with varying degrees of intensity and legal rigor. This was a dark period fueled by fear, superstition, and deeply held religious beliefs, where spectral evidence and community gossip could easily turn into a capital offense. You might find yourself walking on eggshells, constantly aware that a strange dream, a sudden illness in a neighbor's child, or even an argument could be twisted into evidence against you. One mainstream historical fact is that colonial laws against witchcraft were largely based on English common law, which defined witchcraft as a felony, punishable by death. These laws were rooted in the belief that individuals could enter into a pact with the devil, gaining supernatural powers to harm others. The trials often involve highly theatrical proceedings, where accusers would fall into fits, claim to see specters, or describe invisible torments. Imagine being on trial, and your accuser is writhing on the floor, pointing at you and screaming that your invisible spirit is pinching them. It's a surreal and terrifying scenario, isn't it? A quirky tidbit, if we can call anything from this period quirky, is that the evidence used in these trials was often incredibly flimsy and illogical by modern standards. Besides spectral evidence, proof could include witches' marks, any mole, birthmark, or blemish on the body. The inability to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly, or even simply bad luck befalling a neighbor after an argument. You could be accused for simply having too many cats, or for being a woman who dared to own property independently. It's a testament to how easily fear and prejudice can warp the concept of justice. Historians still argue vehemently about the underlying causes of the witchcraft hysteria. Were they purely religious? Were there socioeconomic tensions at play, perhaps between established families and newcomers? Did psychological factors like mass hysteria contribute significantly? Some scholars point to factors like land disputes, gender roles, and even ergot poisoning, a fungus that can cause hallucinations, as potential contributors, while others emphasize the profound religious convictions and anxieties of the time. The punishments for those found guilty of witchcraft were severe, often leading to execution, usually by hanging. This was not a quick or quiet affair. Executions were public events, serving as stark warnings to the community. Remember that pervasive scrutiny we discussed earlier? In the context of witchcraft, that scrutiny became a deadly weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor and often leading to tragic injustices. You'd live in a constant state of apprehension, knowing that a single accusation, however baseless, could unravel your entire life and lead to your demise. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when fear overrides reason and due process is abandoned. Steering away from the existential dread of witchcraft, let's consider a more mundane, yet equally indicative, set of regulations. Those concerning children and disobedience. In colonial America, children were not viewed with the same kind of leniency or protected status as they are today. They were often seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household and community from a young age, and obedience was paramount. Disobedience wasn't just a nuisance. It was a serious moral failing, potentially even a spiritual one, that could lead to legal repercussions. You were expected to be a dutiful, quiet, and productive member of the household, even if you were barely taller than a fence post. One mainstream historical fact is that Puritan laws, in particular, were famously strict regarding children's behavior. This stubborn child law, enacted in Massachusetts in 1646, is a notorious example. While rarely enforced to its extreme, this law theoretically allowed for the death penalty for children over 16 who were stubborn or rebellious and refused to obey their parents. While executions under this law are virtually unheard of, its mere existence highlights the profound emphasis placed on filial obedience and the severity with which defiance was viewed. Imagine being a teenager in colonial Massachusetts, knowing that your temper tantrum or refusal to do chores could, in the most extreme interpretation, be a capital offense. It certainly puts modern grounding into perspective, doesn't it? A quirky tidbit is that beyond these overarching laws, many colonial households had incredibly detailed rules for their children, often written down and posted. These could cover everything from how to speak to elders, how to sit at the dinner table, to how much noise was permissible. Children might even be expected to address their parents with formal titles like sir and madam. You can almost hear the endless lectures. Sit up straight, child. Don't look your elders in the eye. And certainly, don't forget to address me properly, lest you be accused of insolence. It's a far cry from a modern because I said so approach. Here it was often because God said so, and the law agrees. Historians still argue about the practical application and true impact of these harsh laws and strict upbringing methods. Did they produce a generation of perfectly obedient, industrious citizens, or did they merely suppress childhood expression and lead to quiet rebellion? Some scholars suggest that while the laws existed on paper, the daily realities of family life often involved more pragmatic and less severe forms of discipline. Others argue that the constant threat of legal intervention, even if rarely carried out, created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and conformity for colonial youth. Punishments for disobedient children, though usually not involving the stocks or pillory directly, could still be severe. Fines, public rebukes in church, or even being placed with another family as an indentured servant to learn discipline, were possibilities. The goal was always to correct the child's moral compass and instill respect for authority, both parental and divine. So, the next time your little one complains about their screen time being cut short, you can gently remind them that in colonial times, just being a bit too boisterous could have led to a very different kind of timeout. Having explored the often unsettling laws concerning humans, let's now consider a truly fascinating and sometimes amusing subset of colonial legal codes, the animal law oddities. You might assume that livestock and pets were just property, but in colonial America, animals occasionally found themselves at the center of legal disputes, and sometimes even as defendants. Yes, you heard that right. Animals could, in certain circumstances, be tried for offenses. It sounds like something out of a whimsical fable, but for the colonists, these were serious matters. One mainstream historical fact is that laws were in place to regulate livestock, particularly regarding trespassing and damage to crops. If your pig wandered into your neighbor's cornfield and had a grand old time munching on their dinner, you, as the owner, would be held liable for the damages. This wasn't just a friendly neighborly dispute. There could be fines involved, and repeated offenses could lead to more severe penalties for the owner. Imagine the tension in the air as your prize-winning cow gives you that innocent look, all while having just decimated misses. Henderson's prize-winning pumpkins. It truly makes you appreciate fences. A quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle is the concept of animal trials for bestiality or other perceived transgressions. While rare, there are documented instances in colonial records of animals being brought to trial, sometimes even with legal representation for the animal, usually their owner. The most well-known cases involve bestiality, where both the human and the animal could be tried and, if found guilty, executed. There's a bizarre logic here. If the animal was a knowing participant in a sinful act, then it too was considered tainted and worthy of punishment. You can almost picture a bewildered. It's an extreme example of the human desire to impose moral order on the natural world. Historians still argue about the true intent behind these animal trials. Were they purely superstitious? Were they a reflection of a deeply ingrained belief in divine retribution, even extending to the animal kingdom? Some scholars suggest that these trials were less about the animal's culpability and more about publicly shaming the human owner or reinforcing strict moral codes within the community. Others argue that, given the prevalent religious beliefs, there is a genuine conviction that animals could be instruments of evil or, at the very least, could be involved in sinful acts. Beyond these more dramatic instances, there were also laws about public safety related to animals. Dogs running loose, or even specific breeds deemed dangerous, could be subject to regulation. You might find ordinances requiring dogs to be leashed or muzzled in public areas. This reflects a practical concern for public order, even amidst the more peculiar legal interpretations. So, while your modern pet might just get a stern look for raiding the garbage, a colonial Fido might have faced a much sterner and stranger judicial reckoning. Having tiptoed around the unusual legal standing of animals, let's now delve into another often overlooked area of colonial law: forgotten financial crimes. You might think financial misdeeds are a modern invention, but the colonists had their own unique brand of economic offenses, often reflecting the nascent and often precarious nature of their economies. These weren't just about stealing a pig. They were about maintaining economic stability, ensuring fair trade, and punishing deceit that could undermine the fragile trust within a community. One mainstream historical fact is that counterfeiting currency was a particularly severe financial crime. In a time before centralized banking and standardized paper money, local currencies, foreign coins, and even commodity money, like beaver pelts or tobacco, circulated. The integrity of this system was paramount. If you're caught producing fake coins or bills, the punishment was often brutal, ranging from public branding, remember those scarlet letters, to having your ears cropped, or even death, depending on the colony and the severity of the offense. Imagine the painstaking work of trying to forge a convincing coin without modern tools. knowing that failure could cost you more than just a trip to jail. It makes you realize how vulnerable early economies were to such deceptions. A quirky tidbit related to these financial crimes is the concept of forestalling, engrossing, and reg rating. These were terms for economic practices that today we might simply call smart business. But in colonial times, they were viewed as illicit attempts to manipulate markets and create artificial scarcity. Forestalling was buying goods before they reached the open market to drive up prices. Engrossing was buying up large quantities of a commodity to monopolize it. Reg rating was buying goods and then reselling them quickly for a higher price in the same market. You can almost hear the indignant whispers of townsfolk. That rascal just bought all the rye before it even got to the market. He's forestalling us. These laws reflected a communal concern for fair access to vital goods, rather than a belief in free market capitalism. It's like being punished for daring to buy in bulk. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of these anti-market manipulation laws. Did they genuinely protect consumers and ensure fair prices, or did they stifle economic innovation and growth? Some scholars suggest that these laws often proved difficult to enforce as colonial economies grew more complex and trade expanded. Others contend that in smaller, more isolated communities, the threat of legal action for such practices did maintain a degree of economic stability and prevented rampant exploitation. The punishments for these financial offenses, beyond the severe ones for counterfeiting, often included significant fines, restitution to the wrong parties, and public shaming. You might be forced to stand in the pillory with a sign proclaiming your economic deceit, a very public loss of credibility in a community where trust was essential for doing business. Remember how crucial reputation was in these small societies? Being known as a forestaller or engrosser could ruin your livelihood far more effectively than a mere monetary penalty. It was a clear message. Economic fairness was as important as moral uprightness in the eyes of colonial law. From the intricate web of colonial commerce, let's now consider a deeply sensitive and complex aspect of colonial law: the Native American legal interactions. This isn't a straightforward narrative of law as colonists understood it, but rather a series of evolving and often fraught legal dealings between the European settlers and the indigenous peoples whose lands they were settling upon. You see, while colonists had their own legal codes, Native American nations had their own ancient systems of justice, governance, and dispute resolution. The collision of these two very different legal philosophies often led to misunderstanding, conflict, and ultimately, great injustice. One mainstream historical fact is that treaties were often signed between colonial governments and Native American tribes. These treaties theoretically defined land boundaries, trade agreements, and rules for peaceful coexistence. However, the interpretation of these treaties often differed dramatically. For the colonists, a treaty might be a definitive legal document signifying land cession in perpetuity. For many Native American nations, it might have been understood as an agreement for shared use or a temporary arrangement of friendship, not a permanent surrender of their ancestral territories. Imagine two parties speaking entirely different legal languages, trying to conduct business, and the profound implications that would have. It's a recipe for confusion at best and outright exploitation at worst. A quirky tidbit, if we can call it that, is how colonial courts sometimes attempted to apply English common law to Native Americans accused of crimes against colonists, or even against other Native Americans on colonial claimed land. This was often done without a full understanding or respect for tribal sovereignty or indigenous legal traditions. You might find a Native American individual being tried by a colonial jury under laws they didn't recognize for actions that might have been permissible or handled differently within their own cultural context. It's like trying to play chess when one player thinks they're playing checkers. The rules just don't align. This often created deep resentment and a sense of profound injustice among indigenous communities. Historians still argue vehemently about the extent to which colonial legal systems were truly capable of delivering justice to Native Americans. Were these interactions purely about subjugation, or were there genuine, albeit often flawed, attempts at establishing legal frameworks? Some scholars highlight instances where Native Americans successfully used colonial courts to their advantage, particularly in land disputes, showcasing a degree of legal agency. Others emphasize the systemic biases inherent in the colonial legal system, which consistently favored settler interests and ultimately led to the marginalization and dispossession of indigenous peoples. The consequences of these legal interactions for Native Americans were often devastating. Land was seized, traditional ways of life were disrupted, and entire communities faced the constant threat of violence and legal subjugation. While direct punishments for crimes might involve fines or imprisonment, the overarching punishment was the loss of sovereignty and cultural autonomy. You'd witness your way of life being slowly, systematically dismantled by a legal system that often saw your very existence as an impediment to its own expansion. It's a sobering reminder of the power dynamics inherent in legal systems and how they can be wielded for control, not just for justice. After journeying through the bewildering world of colonial odd laws and quirky punishments, we arrive at their legacy in American law. It might seem like a distant, irrelevant past, full of strange ideas and even stranger legal practices. But the truth is, the seeds of these early colonial legal systems, with all their peculiarities, profoundly influenced the development of American legal traditions and continue to echo in subtle ways even today. You might not see anyone in the stocks, but the underlying principles or reactions against them are still very much a part of our legal landscape. One mainstream historical fact is that many fundamental concepts of American law, such as due process, the right to a jury trial, and the protection against cruel and unusual punishment, evolved directly from the English common law that the colonists brought with them. However, the colonial period also saw the development of distinctly American legal innovations, often born out of necessity or local adaptation. While the blue laws might seem antiquated, the very idea of regulating public morality, even if now in a vastly different form, has never entirely vanished from American legal thought. Think about debates over alcohol sales on Sundays, or zoning laws that restrict certain businesses in residential areas, faint echoes of a time when every aspect of life was deemed subject to communal oversight. A quirky tidbit, perhaps a more comforting one, is that the very excesses and absurdities of some colonial punishments actually contributed to the later development of more humane and formalized legal procedures. The public outcry against the Salem witch trials, for example, played a significant role in questioning the use of spectral evidence and emphasizing the need for concrete proof in legal proceedings. It's almost as if the system had to reach its most bizarre and unjust extremes before it could begin to self-correct and evolve into something more equitable. You can picture a weary colonist, after witnessing yet another peculiar public shaming, quietly thinking, there has to be a better way to do this. Historians still argue about the precise lineage of certain legal concepts from the colonial period to the present. Did the strong emphasis on community control in early colonial law truly lay the groundwork for later ideas of local governance and direct democracy? Or did the harshness of the punishments primarily instill a lasting skepticism of government overreach? Some scholars suggest that the colonial experience, with its unique blend of religious fervor and practical necessity, created a distinct American legal identity that diverged significantly from its English roots. Others emphasize the continuity, arguing that many colonial laws were simply localized versions of broader European legal trends. Ultimately, your journey through colonial America's peculiar punishments and odd laws reveals a society grappling with profound questions of order, morality, and individual liberty. It was a time of experimentation, often with uncomfortable results, as communities tried to forge a new way of life in a challenging environment. These experiences, both good and bad, were etched into the collective memory and paved the way for the legal systems we know today. You might find yourself drifting off now, perhaps dreaming of a world where your daily routine isn't subject to a legislative committee or where your choice of fabric doesn't land you in a legal bind.